Less than 2 hours before a 50% tariff was set to hit $20 billion worth of Canadian goods, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that Canada and the United States had a deal. Not a tentative framework, not a working proposal, a deal in capital letters punctuated with an exclamation point. He announced the tariffs were paused for 3 days. He declared the long-dead Keystone XL pipeline might be, in his words, awoken from the grave. Within hours, the internet was flooded with a rendering his own account posted, showing him yanking a pipeline out of the ground beside a tombstone labeled "Buried by Biden." It looked, by every measure of political theater, like total victory. And then Mark Carney released his own statement, and it said almost none of that. No mention of Keystone, no declaration of victory, no exclamation points. Just one careful sentence that has been quoted more than almost anything else out of Ottawa this week. Substantial progress has been made, although there is important work still to be done. That is not what a government sounds like when it is just capitulated to someone else's terms. That is what a government sounds like when it is refusing to let another country write the headline for it. If you're new here, stick around, because the gap between what Washington announced and what Ottawa actually confirmed is the real story unfolding right now, and almost nobody is reading it correctly. Let's rebuild the timeline properly, because the sequence of exactly what was said, by whom, and in what order, tells you everything about where the real leverage in this relationship currently sits. On July 20th, 2026, the White House signed 3 separate proclamations under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a law that had not been used to impose tariffs by any American president since 1949. The proclamations targeted Canadian automobiles, alcoholic beverages, and dairy products specifically, with annexes extending the same 50% duty into wine, cement, furniture, hockey sticks, and hundreds of other tariff lines, covering close to $20 billion in Canadian exports, according to the United States Trade Representative's own figures. The 30-day clock that statute requires began ticking immediately, setting an effective date of 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on August 19th, 2026. A White House proclamation issued the same Tuesday night formally moved the tariff's effective date from August 19th to 12:01 a.m. Eastern on August 22nd, applying specifically to the 3 original sets of duties covering American liquor, dairy products, automobiles, and auto parts, meaning the legal machinery behind all 3 July proclamations remains fully intact and ready to activate automatically the moment that new window closes without a finalized agreement in place. Crucially, none of it offered any protection under USMCA, the very trade agreement Trump himself signed during his first term, meaning goods that would normally qualify for duty-free treatment got hit with the full new rate regardless of where they were made or how they were certified. Over the following weeks, Canadian officials pursued something that looked far more like disciplined silence than panic. Prime Minister Carney gathered the country's premiers behind closed doors at a First Ministers meeting in Charlottetown and told reporters afterward that everything was on the table, declining to name a single specific retaliatory measure. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc made repeated trips to Washington, describing each round of talks in the same careful, information-light language, calling sessions constructive without ever elaborating on what was actually discussed. By the second week of August, Carney was describing the negotiations publicly as very intense and delicate, adding pointedly that this is not the time to talk about negotiations in public. That kind of restraint from a head of government facing a 50% tariff deadline is not accidental. It reflects a deliberate strategic choice from someone who spent 13 years at Goldman Sachs and ran both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England before ever entering electoral politics. Someone who understands, at a level few other world leaders do, that the side that reveals its position first in a high-stakes negotiation typically loses the most ground. Then came Monday and Tuesday of this week, when Carney and Trump spoke twice by phone within roughly 24 hours of each other, according to statements released by the Prime Minister's office that offered almost no detail about the actual content of either call. On Tuesday evening, less than 2 hours before the tariffs were legally set to take effect, Trump moved first, and moved loudly. His Truth Social post announced the tariffs paused for 3 days, formally shifting the effective date from August 19th to 12:01 a.m. on August 22nd, and framed the pause as resting on the fact that the 2 countries, subject to the finalization of documents, already have a deal. He then pivoted almost immediately to Keystone XL, the pipeline project that would carry more than 800,000 barrels of Alberta crude daily down through Montana, South Dakota, and Nebraska, a project first proposed nearly 2 decades ago, rejected by President Obama in 2015, approved by Trump himself in 2017, and then formally revoked by President Biden in 2021. Trump's framing turned a trade negotiation into a symbolic reversal of one of his predecessor's most contested environmental decisions, a move several political analysts described as being aimed as much at scoring a domestic political point against Biden's legacy as at actually settling anything with Canada. Carney's response, released the same evening, conspicuously left Keystone out entirely. His statement instead described weeks of intensive discussions aimed at addressing outstanding trade issues and delivering greater certainty and real benefits for Canadian businesses, workers, farmers, and families. It confirmed progress had been made. It did not confirm a deal. And in a follow-up post the next day, Carney went further, stating plainly that Canada entered these discussions with the best overall trade terms, language that reads far more like a leader defending his own government's negotiating position than one accepting someone else's version of events. Political analysts covering the story on both sides of the border picked up on the contrast almost immediately. One CBC commentator noted that Trump signaling Keystone as part of the deal is actually helpful to Carney, because it gives him political cover for the trade-offs he will eventually need to justify to Canadians, while another pointed out that Carney's own statement was, in his words, notably less triumphant than the version coming out of Washington. That gap between the two statements is not a communications accident. It is the entire story. The auto sector detail deserves one more layer of context before moving on, because Volpe's warning about relocating plants is not simply a rhetorical flourish designed to grab a headline. Ontario alone hosts assembly operations tied to nearly every major North American manufacturer, employing tens of thousands of workers directly and supporting many more through the parts and logistics networks feeding those plants every single day. A tariff rate that pushes above the industry's thin operating margin does not simply raise sticker prices modestly. It forces genuine capital allocation decisions inside corporate boardrooms in Detroit, Tokyo, and Stuttgart about where the next investment cycle actually gets built. That is precisely why Volpe, sitting inside the federal government's own circle of trade advisors, has been so specific and so public about the exact numerical threshold that separates an acceptable outcome from one that risks real permanent job losses on the Canadian side of the border, regardless of how the broader headline deal eventually gets framed by either government. There is also the dairy dispute sitting quietly underneath all of this, one of the original 3 proclamations that started this entire chain of events back on July 20th, and that has received noticeably less public attention over the past week than either Autos or Keystone. Washington's specific complaint centers on Canada's supply management system, the domestic pricing and quota structure that governs dairy imports, and the argument that Canada offers more generous cheese quotas to the European Union under its separate CETA agreement than it extends to the United States under USMCA. Canada has contested that framing for years, arguing it mischaracterizes 2 fundamentally different trade relationships, rather than representing genuine discrimination against American producers. That dispute has not disappeared simply because the headlines this week have been dominated by an oil pipeline and a 3-day tariff pause. It remains one of the 3 original proclamations still technically scheduled to take effect on August 22nd if the documents Trump referenced in his post are not actually finalized in time, a detail that matters enormously to Canadian dairy farmers watching this negotiation unfold with considerably less patience than the celebratory social media coverage might suggest. It's worth pausing on the historical weight of Section 338 itself for a moment, because the legal instrument sitting underneath this entire standoff is not simply a technical footnote. It is one of the reasons Carney's team has never treated any single Trump deadline as truly final. The statute sat completely unused for tariff purposes for 96 consecutive years before this July, untouched through Korea, through Vietnam, through the Cold War, through the 2008 financial crisis, and through Trump's own first presidential term, when his administration relied instead on the more procedurally structured Section 232 and Section 301 authorities. The reason it resurfaced now traces back to a Supreme Court ruling delivered in February of 2026, one that struck down Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the broad, flexible tool he had previously used to impose tariffs on dozens of countries at once without seeking a single congressional vote. That ruling forced White House lawyers into an urgent search through nearly a century of dormant trade law for a replacement authority, offering the same speed, and Section 338 is what they found sitting on the books, essentially forgotten since the Truman administration. Legal scholars have argued for years that the provision was effectively superseded by newer statutes passed in 1962 and 1974, meaning any tariffs imposed under it now sit on genuinely contested legal ground, a fact Canadian negotiators have been fully aware of throughout every single round of these talks. Now let's talk about what actually appears to be inside this still unfinished agreement, because the details that have leaked out over the past 48 hours reveal a much more complicated picture than either side's public statements suggest. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer told reporters that negotiators have eliminated some of the irritants that have built up over the past year, while Trump himself hinted, without confirming outright, that changes to tariffs on Canadian autos could be part of the final package, along with a possible reduction in existing American tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. A senior official briefed on the talks, speaking anonymously because they were not authorized to discuss negotiations publicly before a final agreement, indicated that restoring the flow of American alcohol back onto Canadian store shelves remains a whole separate discussion, one apparently tied to Canada easing its own retaliatory measures as part of whatever final package eventually gets signed. And that detail alone triggered a small but telling moment of friction inside Canada itself. Following a virtual meeting between Carney and the provincial premiers on Wednesday, Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston told reporters that Carney had directly asked the provinces to return American alcohol to store shelves, a request Houston confirmed came straight out of the negotiating table in Washington, and one he said he would be willing to act on for the Prime Minister at this point in the process. That single request carries more weight than it might first appear. Canadian provinces pulled American liquor from government store shelves back in early 2025 in a coordinated, almost unanimous response to Trump's original tariffs, an action Ottawa never formally ordered, but that premiers across the country embraced together anyway. Asking those same premiers to reverse that decision now, as part of a trade deal still being finalized, is exactly the kind of concession that would normally read as capitulation. But Houston's own framing complicated that read considerably, because he paired his willingness to act with a pointed reminder of his own, telling reporters he still wants to see Trump deliver the better deal Carney has repeatedly promised Canadians, adding that before this entire fight began, Canada faced basically no tariffs at all going into the United States. That is not the language of a province simply falling in line. That is a premier agreeing to one specific reversible gesture while making absolutely clear that the underlying scorecard has not yet been settled in Canada's favor. Alberta added its own layer of complexity to the picture almost immediately. Premier Danielle Smith responded to the apparent Keystone revival by welcoming the idea in principle, while immediately widening the frame far beyond a single pipeline, stating that Alberta wants to build new pipelines heading west toward Pacific Tidewater as well, not simply revive an old project designed to move Canadian crude south into the American market once again. That is a meaningfully different vision of Canada's energy future than the one Trump's celebratory social media posts implied, and it reflects exactly the kind of diversification instinct that has been building across the Canadian Federation for the past 18 months, an instinct that predates this specific negotiation by years and shows no sign of reversing just because one American pipeline project might come back onto the table. Quebec offered its own distinct signal during this same window, one that received less coverage than Alberta's pipeline comments, but arguably said just as much about the mood inside Canada's provincial leadership. Premier Christine Frechette spoke to reporters in Quebec City the same day the pause was announced, striking a tone considerably more measured than the celebratory framing coming out of Washington, one that emphasized continued caution rather than premature relief. That caution reflects something important about how this entire standoff has been managed at the provincial level from the very beginning. When Doug Ford in Ontario, Danielle Smith in Alberta, and now Christine Frechette in Quebec all respond to the same announcement with noticeably different degrees of enthusiasm, ranging from cautiously optimistic about pipelines to simply withholding judgment altogether. It tells you Carney has not actually delivered a single unified national verdict for anyone to react to yet. He has delivered a status update, and premiers across the political spectrum appear to understand that distinction clearly, choosing their own words just as carefully as Carney chose his. There's also a genuinely awkward wrinkle sitting underneath Trump's celebratory framing of Keystone that several energy analysts flagged almost immediately. Commodity analysts pointed out that reviving a mothballed pipeline project as a political trophy does very little to actually guarantee it gets built, since the private capital required to finish construction depends on multi-decade investment horizons that stretch well beyond any single presidential term. One energy market analyst put the skepticism bluntly, asking why any serious investor would commit billions of dollars to a project that could simply be killed again the moment political control in Washington changes hands, exactly as it was killed once, already under a different administration. Framing the pipeline's revival as a decisive trade war win, in other words, may carry more symbolic weight in a social media post than practical weight inside an actual corporate boardroom deciding whether to restart construction. It's also worth remembering exactly how many times a hard deadline in this specific relationship has already come and gone without producing the clean resolution either side initially promised. Because that history is precisely why nobody serious is treating this 3-day pause as some kind of guaranteed finish line. Carney and Trump first agreed to aim for a broader deal within 30 days of meeting at the G7 summit in Kananaskis back in June of 2025. That window closed without an agreement. A second deadline arrived on August 1st, 2025, accompanied by a Trump letter posted to Truth Social threatening a flat 35% tariff on all Canadian goods if no deal materialized. That deadline closed too, without the threatened rate ever taking full effect in that exact form. Carney told reporters at the time that Canada would not accept a bad deal simply to hit an artificial calendar date, language nearly identical to what his office has been repeating throughout this current round of talks more than a year later. Given that pattern, treating any single Trump announcement, however triumphant the accompanying social media post, as the definitive final word on this relationship would mean ignoring roughly 18 months of essentially identical cycles that have played out again and again without a permanent resolution. Meanwhile, back home in Ottawa, the political pressure on Carney has been building from an entirely different direction, one that has nothing to do with Washington at all. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has spent the past several days pressing Carney publicly to ensure that whatever final agreement emerges genuinely delivers what Carney himself promised. Canadians repeatedly over the past year, a deal explicitly framed as better than the tariff-free access Canada enjoyed before this entire confrontation began. That promise, Canada will not accept a bad deal, dates back more than a year, first made after a meeting with provincial leaders and repeated by Carney so many times. Since that, it has effectively become the defining line of his entire approach to these negotiations. Every partial concession, every gesture like asking premiers to restock American alcohol, now gets measured publicly against that specific standard. And opposition politicians in Ottawa are making sure that measurement happens loudly and in real time rather than quietly after the fact. This is precisely the pressure that explains why Carney's own public statements have remained so carefully hedged even as Trump celebrates. A former deputy chief of staff to the previous prime minister described what a genuine win would look like for Carney in blunt terms, saying it would mean limiting damage, getting sectoral tariffs lowered significantly, and avoiding the newly threatened duties without giving away much in return. He went further, framing the entire multi-year relationship with this particular American administration in strikingly modest terms, describing the practical goal simply as riding out roughly 2.5 more years of a president who, in his assessment, genuinely likes using tariffs as a tool regardless of the underlying economic logic. That is a sobering, unglamorous way to describe strategy toward America's largest trading partner. But it captures something the celebratory Keystone social media posts entirely obscure. Canada is not treating this specific announcement as the finish line. It is treating it as one data point inside a much longer multi-year management problem. It's worth pausing here to understand exactly why the auto sector has become such a central sticking point inside these final negotiations, because it reveals just how much technical detail sits underneath the celebratory headlines. Flavio Volpe, president of Canada's Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association and a member of the federal government's own group of trade advisors, has been publicly blunt about what an acceptable outcome actually requires. Any negotiated tariff rate on Canadian vehicles and parts, he told reporters, has to sit below the industry's actual profit margin, which he places at roughly 6%, a threshold that matters enormously given that cross-border auto manufacturing has operated at close to 0% tariffs for 60 consecutive years. If automakers are forced to absorb or pass along hundreds of millions of dollars in additional annual costs, Volpe warned, plants located in cities like Brampton or Woodstock, Ontario could simply relocate production to the United States or elsewhere, where operations remain more profitable, a threat that cuts directly against Washington's own stated goal of protecting American manufacturing jobs. Volpe's sharpest line captured the contradiction perfectly, arguing that American negotiators are essentially shooting themselves in the foot by penalizing their own companies for selling to their own customers, since so much of the North American auto supply chain crosses the Canada-U.S. border multiple times before a single finished vehicle ever reaches a dealership lot. There's also a broader economic backdrop that helps explain why Carney has refused to simply accept Washington's framing of victory, regardless of how loudly it gets announced. A report from the Canadian American Business Council, circulated among trade officials in the weeks leading up to this deadline, estimated that a full breakdown in the Canada-U.S. trade relationship could put roughly 102,000 Canadian jobs at risk, a figure that has been cited repeatedly by provincial leaders and business groups pushing Ottawa to secure a resolution quickly. That number sits in tension with an equally important political reality. Carney cannot appear to have secured that resolution simply by accepting whatever terms Washington chooses to announce first on social media, because doing so would hand his domestic political opposition a ready-made narrative that Canada folded under pressure rather than negotiated from a position of genuine strength. Threading that needle, protecting jobs while refusing to let the other side dictate the terms of victory, is exactly the balancing act Carney's carefully hedged statements have been performing all week. Zoom out from the day-to-day maneuvering, and a much larger pattern becomes visible, one that has been building steadily since Trump's very first tariffs landed on Canadian goods back in February of 2025. Throughout this entire 18-month standoff, Canada has been simultaneously doing two things that rarely get covered together in the same headline. It has been negotiating, patiently and carefully, for a workable resolution with its largest trading partner, while also building, deal by deal, an entirely separate architecture of alternatives that reduces how much any single round of American pressure can actually accomplish. In July alone, Canada signed a full free trade agreement with Ecuador and concluded a comprehensive economic partnership with the United Arab Emirates within days of each other. Those agreements sit on top of enhancements to Canada's existing deal with the European Union, active negotiations with the Mercosur bloc in South America, and fresh trade commitments with India targeting a doubling of bilateral trade by 2030. Carney's government has now signed more than 20 new economic and security partnerships since he took office, and construction continues on a $100 billion port expansion project on Canada's Pacific coast, specifically designed to route more exports toward Asian and Gulf markets, instead of relying so heavily on the American border. None of that diversification strategy disappears simply because Trump announced a tentative deal on a Tuesday evening ahead of a looming deadline. If anything, it explains exactly why Carney felt comfortable refusing to rubber stamp Washington's version of events in the first place. A government that had no alternatives beyond the American market would have every incentive to accept whatever terms got announced first, simply to make the immediate threat disappear, since the cost of walking away from the only major buyer available would be catastrophic. A government that has spent 18 months quietly building alternatives across 4 continents has considerably more room to say, in effect, not yet, there's important work still to be done, without that statement reading as weakness to anyone actually paying attention to the broader picture unfolding underneath this single week's headlines. Carney's own statement gestured directly at this dynamic, noting that while negotiators continue this work, Canada remains focused on building a stronger, more independent, and more competitive economy at home, language that reads less like a footnote and more like the actual thesis statement underneath everything else being negotiated this week. There's also a legal dimension sitting quietly underneath all of this that could still reshape the outcome regardless of what gets finalized over the next 3 days. And it is worth being precise about why that legal exposure has shaped Ottawa's negotiating posture from the very beginning. Section 338 predates the World Trade Organization entirely, and legal scholars have long argued the provision was effectively superseded decades ago by the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974, the modern frameworks Congress built specifically to govern exactly this kind of trade dispute, with proper procedural safeguards attached, including formal investigations and clearly defined limits on presidential discretion that Section 338 conspicuously lacks. Canada has already signaled. It intends to pursue legal challenges through multiple channels if a final agreement ultimately fails to materialize, including domestic American courts and the World Trade Organization's own dispute settlement mechanisms, alongside the formal dispute process built directly into USMCA, a process Canada has used successfully against American dairy positions in previous years, producing binding findings the United States was ultimately required to acknowledge even under this same administration. That legal option does not disappear just because this particular 3-day pause bought both sides a bit more breathing room. It remains sitting quietly in reserve, one more reason Carney's negotiators have never needed to treat August 22nd as an absolute immovable cliff edge the way Trump's own social media messaging tends to frame every single deadline he sets, regardless of whether that deadline has historically held or slipped in the months before it. There's also a financial market dimension to this story that rarely makes it into the celebratory headlines, but matters enormously to anyone actually trying to assess how seriously to take Tuesday night's announcement. Canadian steel, aluminum, and auto sector stocks moved noticeably on the news of the pause, but analysts covering cross-border manufacturing were quick to note that genuine relief rallies typically wait for finalized legal text, not social media posts describing documents still being drafted. Companies with real capital on the line, the kind that have to decide whether to expand a Canadian plant or shift production south of the border, have learned over the past 18 months that Trump's public declarations and the eventual signed outcome do not always match precisely, sometimes differing in scope, sometimes in timing, and occasionally in substance. That gap between announcement and actual enforceable text is exactly why serious trade counsel on both sides of the border have continued advising clients to plan around the worst-case scenario until a final proclamation is actually published in the Federal Register, regardless of how confident either leader sounds in a given press conference or social media post. So where does all of this actually leave the relationship as the new 3-day window ticks down toward its own close? Trump has declared victory in the loudest possible terms available to him, tying a trade negotiation to the emotionally charged symbolism of reviving a pipeline, his own predecessor killed, wrapped in a social media post built for maximum viral spread, rather than careful legal precision. Carney has done something quieter and, in its own way, more consequential. He has confirmed real progress without confirming Washington's version of what that progress actually means. He has asked premiers for one specific reversible gesture, while insisting Canada entered these talks, holding the stronger overall terms, and he has kept the country's broader diversification strategy running in the background the entire time, treating this specific announcement as one moment inside a much longer negotiation rather than the final word on it. Whether the documents actually get finalized before the new deadline arrives, whether Keystone XL ever moves a single additional foot of pipe into the ground, and whether Canadian auto tariffs land anywhere close to the threshold. Flavio Volpe says the industry can actually survive. All of that remains genuinely unresolved as of this moment. What is resolved, and what the past 48 hours have made unmistakably clear, is that Canada is no longer willing to simply accept the version of events Washington announces first, and that refusal, quiet, careful, and entirely deliberate, may end up mattering far more to how this entire standoff gets remembered than any single pipeline ever could. There's also a broader lesson worth drawing out of this specific moment, one that extends well past the particulars of pipelines and tariff percentages into how modern trade negotiations between unequal partners actually tend to unfold in practice. When one side controls the news cycle by posting first, loudly, and with maximum emotional framing, the natural temptation for the other side is to respond in kind, matching triumph with triumph, or grievance with grievance. Carney's team has consistently declined that temptation throughout this entire 18-month standoff, choosing instead a kind of deliberate flatness in its own public messaging that can look, to a casual observer scrolling past both statements quickly, almost like passivity. It is not passivity. It is a recognition that the actual outcome of this negotiation will ultimately be measured in signed legal text, published tariff schedules, and verified pipeline permits, not in which leaders' social media account generated more engagement on a given Tuesday night. That distinction between the announcement and the actual enforceable substance behind it is precisely the gap Canada has been navigating carefully all week. And it is the same gap that will determine, once the documents are actually finalized, whether this becomes remembered as the week Canada secured a genuinely better deal, or simply the week two leaders disagreed about how loudly to describe an outcome neither side had fully signed yet. If this breakdown helped you understand what is actually happening behind the headlines this week, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens once this new 3-day window closes. Drop a comment below and tell me directly, do you think Carney is holding out for a genuinely better deal, or is Canada simply managing the optics of an agreement that was always going to happen anyway? And if you know someone who only saw Trump's Keystone post and assumed this whole standoff was already settled, go ahead and share this with them. Because the real story is still being written in the details, neither side has finished negotiating yet.